Well, you led me to my next question. When you prepared that report, you worked on it for 2 years. You knew what was inside it. You knew the story it told. When Attorney General Barr got out ahead of you all and offered his own summary, what were you thinking? What was your reaction? And what were the specific places where you thought, boy, he has completely manipulated what we said?
Let me give you some examples of how he manipulated what we said. So first, he said that the White House fully cooperated with our investigation. Let me just give you one simple fact as to why that is just not true. The President of the United States never sat for an interview and refused to actually tell us what his story was. How is that full cooperation? Another is, even though the Attorney General said Russia interfered with the election, he made it sound like Russia was bipartisan, that it was just to sow discord, where the proof in the case was that Russia had strongly put its thumb on the scale to support candidate Trump in the primary and in the general election. And finally, he made the determination that there was no obstruction of justice. And frankly, everyone 3 weeks later, when you could finally read all of the facts, no reasonable prosecutor could conclude that that was not obstruction of justice. There was so much evidence of the president obstructing our investigation.
So, Andrew, let's go to today in the Times double-barrel stories on President Trump's tax situation, and they appear to have at least viewed some of the tax returns, at least from their reporting, which is incredibly spectacular reporting. If that reporting that you've read about in the Times on his taxes were dropped on your desk when you were back in the Eastern District as a U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, do you see anything in what we've read, what we've found out, that's indictable?
So it's potentially indictable. I don't want to get ahead of the evidence that we have so far, but this is not rocket science. We did this kind of tax case with respect to Paul Manafort. So the irony here is we followed the money with respect to Paul Manafort, but we weren't able to and didn't follow the money with respect to the President of the United States. And what you want to do is you want to look at what is actually reported in the returns, and then you compare it to what it is that the Trump Organization and Donald Trump knew at the time. What was he telling his accountants? One of the reasons that you have the president fighting so hard to keep the information about what that his accountants have from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is because that is critical information. I describe in the book when we found that information with respect to Paul Manafort, that was an aha moment where we knew that we now had a tax case because we could compare what he knew internally versus what he was telling the IRS.
Would his tax assembler, his tax person, whoever it was, would that person also, or that company also be potentially indictable?
Potentially, but you have to remember they're presumably relying on information that they're getting from Donald Trump and people at the Trump Organization. So I would say there's sort of a second tier of people to look at. But it's a good question because one of the things that we found with respect to Paul Manafort is there was a person at his accounting office who knew that Paul Manafort was doing something not just sleazy, but illegal, and that person went along with it. And she ended up being a devastating witness for the government in the Paul Manafort trial, testifying about what she knew and what Paul Manafort had done.
All right, Jonathan Lemire has the final question. Jonathan?
Andrew, I wanted to go back to what you said a moment ago. It was a real pivot point during the investigation, and you expressed frustration that the president didn't sit down for an in-person interview. This is obviously looking in hindsight now, but could that have been handled differently? Could have a subpoena been issued? Was there a way to compel the president to sit down for that interview, which potentially could have changed the course of the investigation? And why wasn't it done at the time? Was it a matter of the fears that the president would disband the entire probe itself?
There was that fear because we had the concern that we were investigating somebody who could pull the plug. But that's an area where, as I described, I disagreed. I was very concerned about the precedent that we were setting by not calling the president to task and not requiring him to testify. Special Counsel Mueller bent over backwards to try and accommodate the president, as has other independent special counsels. But when the answer was, no, I'm not going to answer your questions and have follow-up questions, at that point, I thought it was necessary to get the information. I described it as this is Hamlet without Hamlet. We're missing the central character in our story. And I was very concerned about what this means for the next investigation that we have, God forbid, of a president of the United States, where they're going to be able to look back and say, well, look, this is something that isn't necessary. It wasn't done in the special counsel investigation. And I don't think that is a good precedent to set, because here, his testimony, that is Donald Trump's testimony, was so integral to understanding his intent and motive in looking at all the things that we were charged to look at.
All right, the new book is Where Law Ends, Inside the Mueller Investigation. Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.